My Inquisition army is coming on well, but I feel at this point it's sufficiently large that it needs some kind of battle standard. I originally had this idea about a year ago when watching Kingdom of Heaven, which has in the background of a few shots this big cross standard thing, which got me thinking. I could do something similar with the eagle-topped pillar from the Grimaldus kit, and it would make a pretty cool 40k version of that. But this was going to be by far the most scratch build heavy kit bash I'd ever done, since I just couldn't find a kit that would work well as the basis for this conversion. So I was going to have to build this up from a bunch of entirely separate models. The first thing I did was assemble the guys who will be carrying the platform that the standard rests on. These guys are tech Thralls from Horus Heresy, but for my purposes these were once soldiers of this army who were sufficiently badly wounded doing some kind of heroic deed that they couldn't fight normally anymore and were instead chosen to push this army's greatest relic into battle. They were looking a little too Mechanica-y though, so a load of these cog details were removed. Though I kept the mechanical limbs since it fitted the idea that these were honoured veterans who couldn't fight any longer due to their wounds. These guys weren't going to get any heads or arms just yet, we'll come back to those later, because I wanted to get started on the platform that these guys were going to be pushing. So I took some measurements of them all lined up and found that I needed a roughly 3 by 7 centimeter platform, which I translated to a 3mm thick sheet of plasticard and cut out. This was going to make up the bulk of the upper section of the platform, though it wasn't looking particularly interesting, so I ran my knife along the bottom corners and made this nice little bevel edge cut off bit. It did need to be a little bit bulkier though, so I took some 1mm thick styrene sheet and cut out the walls of a cuboid that I was going to make below the main slab. I cut this out so the platform above slightly overhung the edges, and I sealed the lower section with another slightly overhanging section of 1mm styrene sheet. And now I've got this pretty satisfying and pretty strong tomb looking platform. But I don't just want something flat. I'm going to have the standard itself elevated towards the back to make it seem like a more sacred space. So I cut out and assembled this staircase. Though I did decide about halfway through putting this staircase together that I actually wanted to add a little bit of depth to the side. This would have been way easier to add had I done this before I'd started putting everything together, but you know, you live and you learn. I also added these little arching bits out of the back using some ultra thin styrene to complete the sort of support pillars I had going on. After which I added these eagle heads that I got spare from the Imperial Knight kit. And these have got to be some of my favourite spare bits of all time. They're so useful. Now I could call the platform more or less done, but this front section seemed a little bit too flat. So I cut another section of 1mm styrene to a size a little bit smaller than the top of the main platform, on which I marked some thin borders the whole way around the edge and where the little staircase would sit on top. I then went about cutting out the space in front of the staircase and stuck it down. At which point I realised I'd cut out the wrong side and there was now nothing I could do about it. Fortunately for me, it was actually fine, because the extra space was almost exactly the width of a stair, and so when the staircase was sat on top, it looked perfectly natural. Now it was time to do a little bit of sculpting, so I rolled out some green stuff into long, thin sausages, which I was going to use to make some pipes and cables. But these were going to need a little bit of time to firm up before I used them. So in the meantime, I used the extra green stuff to fill in the recesses I'd just made in the floor and smoothed it out as best as I could. I marked along the side at regular intervals, and then using these bits of styrene I sharpened to push in some grooves to mark out a tiled pattern for the floor. I then went back to those tubes and cut them to fit into the recesses in the side of the staircase and glued them in place. For the void at the back, I used this generator from the Kataphron breacher kit, which I cut down so that it just about fit in the space, and then filled some of the gaps with more tubes and Milliputt. I used Milliputt instead of Greenstuff because it's less flexible, which means that when I'm using it to fill gaps, I can sand it down afterwards, which makes the transition between plastic and Milliputt almost invisible once things are painted. Next I added these void shield bits from the new Horus Heresy quad accelerator platform, which are going to function as a sort of anti-gravity device to take the weight of the platform while the guys pushing it just push it. The platform does also have an actual void shield to protect the otherwise vulnerable standard, but that's hidden away inside. With the platform mostly done, we're now going to move on to the standard sort of guardian guy, known as the Exhortant. He's going to end up standing on that tiled surface we just made. I used the Sanctifier Confessor for this, but I didn't really like the massive fur cloak he has, so I began carefully cutting and sanding it away. I also took the opportunity to repose one of his legs so that he was no longer stood on a little tactical rock and was instead stood flat as you would expect him to be on his little sort of sanctified platform. This did leave me with some large gaps which I used more Greenstuff and Milliputt to fill. I used a combination of the two, or mixed both together across this guy, largely depending on what I just had mixed up at the time, but my favourite is definitely the combination of the two. You can shape it nicely and also sand it pretty well afterwards. The cloak removal had also allowed me to reposition his right arm, so I decided to have his arm held out in front of him in a much more aggressive stance. which I secured by drilling a small hole in the contact points and using a bit of paperclip to pin the arm in place. But I still needed something for him to hold. While the options that came in the kit were cool, I wanted something different, and I chose a skull, one of a set that you'll see the rest of later. I drilled a hole in the back of the skull so that it would be easier to work on, and then used Greenstuff to begin sculpting the hand holding it. And this was by far the most detailed little bit I've ever sculpted. It wasn't actually as complex as you'd think, since you don't need to be super detailed on this scale, but I am still really chuffed with how it came out. Definitely a highlight of my sculpting career so far. The wire I'd used to hold the hand while I sculpted it could then be used to secure the hand to the arm, just as I'd done with the arm and the body. And now we were nearly done with this guy. I just needed to do his head. I was going to use one of the head options from the kit itself, but to let it fit in a little better and to conceal the face, which I didn't particularly like, I was going to give him a skull mask in the same way I do with my infantry. I cut back a skull from the Citadel Skulls box, which you should all get by the way, and shaved down his face until they fit together, after which he was just about done. Then I returned to the platform and it was time to tackle the standard itself. First I had to cut away some small bits that usually attach to the servitor carrying it, and also the damaged bottom section so it would sit better on the little staircase. Then to bed it in, I mounted up some Milliputt around the base, which I'd then cover with candles and skulls. I made these candles by taking a short length of fishing wire, the same stuff I used in my last video to make that rain effect on the Alpha Legion dudes, and then wrapped it in a tiny quantity of Greenstuff, so that just a short length of wire protruded. This section of adding candles and skulls was one of the most time-consuming sections of this already lengthy project, but I think the effort was well worth it. And by the way, these are those skulls I mentioned earlier. I'll leave it a little ambiguous as to exactly who they are, since it's a little bit cooler that way, but you'll have enough information to have a good guess of who these guys are by the end. With that done, I was really on the home stretch for assembly. I gave these Scion Heads I would be using as the helmets for the standard bearer guys the same skull face treatment I did for the preacher dude, and then attached their arms. Since the Tech Thrall kit only comes with left arms, I had to cut and flip the arms for the carriers on the right side and avoid any non-mechanical hands that would have been harder to just swap round. Throughout this process, I'd also used leftover sculpting material to make these little spaces that are going to function as these guys' other arm and connect them with the big platform the standard's on. At this point, I also drilled a small hole in the tiles and the underside of the exortant so that I could attach him with magnets and use him on his own base at some point if I ever wanted to. Now all that stood between me and final assembly was the base, and while I do that, I'll explain a little more of the lore of this model. The standard itself and the role of the exortant who rides with it are some of the oldest parts of this army. The standard being a pillar, originally from the Imperial Palace, that was found in the rubble after the Siege of Terra, which was repurposed as a battle standard by the first Lord Inquisitor to command this army, and the role of the exortant created at the same time. Its age is why the role still comes with that slightly extravagant hat, something that the current commanding Lord Inquisitor would likely not have implemented. Why this fallen pillar came to be so holy to this army I will leave to the end. But it has such an impact that the soldiers in this army can be brought into such an intense religious fervour by it, that in close situations, the presence of this standard can be the difference between victory and defeat. Though were the standard ever to fall, the consequences would be dire, with soldiers turning their weapons on themselves or fleeing the battlefield altogether because all is lost. As a result, it is quite a rare sight and only ever brought out when needed, but also sufficiently safe for it to be rescued should things take a turn. And on that note, everything is built! I'm really happy with how it's looking. I do actually end up adding about 10 extra candles later, but most of the model is done. I'd hoped to add some long trailing purity seals, but the stuff I'd got to make them out of turned out to be far too difficult to cut, so I'll need to rethink that idea and come back to it later. I also cut my finger on it while trying to make it work, so if you see a plaster appear on my thumb while I paint, that's why. I primed the model black, and began, as I always do, on the armour, layering from black to half and half Eshin Grey and black over the top 70%-ish of the model, Eshin Grey on the top 50%, and Mechanicus Standard Grey on the top 25%, but that is only a rough guideline. The whole thing is then darkened down with Nuln Oil, but that made it a little too shiny, so I used Storm Shield to dull it down again, before finishing off with a Dawnstone Edge highlight. The next area I tackled was the red, starting with a 2-to-1 mix of Khorne Red and black. I then used layers of Khorne Red and Mephiston Red to layer and highlight. I tried to dry brush the tiles, but this just didn't come out quite right, so I manually highlighted everything instead. After which I used some old formula Carabel Crimson to give the red some extra richness. Next I painted the fatigues and leather areas. I did this by layering Rhinox hide over the original black base coat, and then using a sort of stipply highlight of Gothor brown over the top to give the illusion of texture. The gold was next, using a similar layering up approach from 50/50 Rhinox hide and Balthazar gold, through Balthazar gold, and then onto a wash of Agrax Earthshade, and a highlight layer of half and half Balthazar Gold and Retributor armor. My biggest issue during this stage was the gold platform at the top. It really was just looking too flat, and it was about this point in the process I realised I really should have gone in for some more texture, but I did find a workaround eventually. The iron areas I painted with Iron Warriors, and highlighted messily with Lead Belcher. I didn't want this section to be a particularly big focal point, so I darkened them down with Nuln Oil and then some rust, which I created using these browns and oranges. At the moment, particularly on the sides of the platform, that orange really shines, but we'll deal with that at the end. I wanted the weathering on the platform itself to be subtle, since it's pretty important, but no matter how well you cleaned it yesterday, in the conditions these guys fight in, it's going to get at least a little rusty quite quickly. But not quite this rusty, we are going to tone it down. At this point I should probably mention, throughout this project, I found various cables and wires that I'd missed during the previous stages, so these are actually constantly being painted, but this is when I did them most deliberately, with black and the same 2-to-1 mix of corn red and black I used on the armour. I also painted in the generator at this point, with the little side generator things on the carriers, using a 2-to-1 mix of corn red and Cantor blue, which was then highlighted with Mephiston red. I then dealt with the skin, starting with a 50-50 mix of Bugman's Glow and Cadian Flesh Tone, and then using pure Cadian Flesh Tone and mixing in some white to get a slightly desaturated pale skin tone, which I made appear bruised around the mechanical portions of the model with Caribou Crimson. The black areas were already black, because of the primer, which meant that we could get straight onto highlighting, which I did with Eshin Grey. And with that, we are already on the home stretch. Well, I say already, this actually took a couple of full working days, but since it's going by quite fast here, I guess it makes sense to say that. This is the point in the process where I fixed the problem with the big flat platform. I masked off about a step's width at the top and the width of the masking tape, which was about 3mm, round the edge. I then filled in this space with black. When I removed the masking tape, it turned out it hadn't worked very well, but it had done roughly what I needed it to do, and the layers of paint had actually also given us a slight height difference between the black areas and the gold, which solved our flat problem to an extent. I'll come back to this black section, but for now I added those candles I mentioned earlier and got to work painting them, with Zandri Dust, washing with Seraphim Sepia and then highlighting with Morghast Bone. And then I turned to the bones. There are actually bones, or more specifically skulls, all over this model. It's Warhammer, in all fairness, and I painted these all in the same way. I started from a black base coat, layering up with Gothor Brown, then Baneblade Brown, and finally Screaming Skull on just the brightest areas. This has got to be one of my favourite recipes I've ever come up with. It's just got a really nice depth to it, and it also nicely doesn't blend in too much with the candles, which was something I was worried about. Now I could deal with that black slab, which I wanted to paint as a sort of marble. Thanks to my Tomb Kings, this isn't the first time I've tried painting marble. Here you can see it on this War Sphinx that I started and never quite finished a few years ago. I used the same technique on the slab here, but with some slightly different colours, using Cantor Blue and Storm Vermin Fur to paint in these tiny vein-like lines. I used the Storm Vermin Fur randomly to brighten sections and edge highlight, after which I gave it a gloss varnish, which I think was a slight improvement on my War Sphinx marble technique, even though I do think using such a dark marble in this instance might have been a bit of a mistake. Now for the last proper surface to paint on the model, the standard itself. I base coated this with Storm Vermin Fur and then dry brushed up with Dawnstone, and then I darkened down the recesses with Nuln Oil. But things were looking a little too shiny, so I dulled everything down with Storm Shield. After which I did a small edge highlight with a 50-50 mix of Dawnstone and Ulthothan Grey. Then I used pure Ulthothan Grey just on the sharpest edges, and with that, all that we have left to do are the final touches, and of course the base. I painted in the tips of the candle wicks with white, Trollslayer Orange, and then Flashkits Yellow. I then used a very thin layer of Trollslayer Orange to give the surrounding surfaces a warm glow. The eyes of the crew were then painted white, and then thinned down Corn Red, Mephiston Red, and Evil Sun Scarlet, after which a final dot of white, which I covered with a super thin glaze of Evil Sun Scarlet just to get that rich redness in the glow. At this point I added some freehand detail with Ulthothan Grey. This was mainly in the form of these little Inquisition symbols, but I also added these tiny random scratchy bits of text to the long drapey bits hanging down the front of the Exhortant. For the final touch on the model, I used Smoke Pigment by AK Interactive to darken down those rusty metal areas I spoke about earlier, and also to darken down the section of the standard just above where the glow stops, which I really think sold the effect. The base was pretty simple, and it used a lot of the same paints and techniques that I've already used, so I won't go into detail too much here. The only new paints used were on the blood pools. Those had been filled in earlier with Vallejo still water, so that they were now dry enough to be painted black. Then a mix of 2-to-1 Blood for the Blood God and Black Templar was used to paint in the bulk of the pool. And while this paint was still wet, I dabbed Blood for the Blood God around the edges and wet blended it in, giving the illusion of changing depth. All I needed to do now was glue down some dark green tufts and paint the base trim black, and with that, the model was finally all done. There exists a truly ancient source within the archives of the Inquisition. Written by an unknown author, it dates all the way back to the Siege of Terra itself. The entry reads as follows. When those abominations first breached the outer walls of the palace, there was little its defenders could do but be cut down where they stood. The harrowing sight of that slaughter will stay with me till the end of my days. There was but one ray of hope in that chamber, an unlikely sight. 8 soldiers of the Solar Auxilia who stood firm. Of course, they did not last long before they too were torn asunder by those wretched things. But for a moment, they stood gathered round a fallen pillar, topped with the winged icon of the Empire. And round that symbol, and for that brief moment, it seemed as if they knew no fear. Though this record is to be destroyed by the Ordo Redactus for false assertions of chaotic entities within the Terran Palace, it holds an important piece of history, since these 8 Solar Auxilia would unknowingly set events in motion that would result in the creation of a fanatical army of demon hunters who would worship the very same pillar that they fought under 10,000 years earlier. I'm really happy with how this turned out, and though I do still plan to add those purity seals I talked about earlier, at least for now, it's done. I've definitely learned a lot about scratch building during this, particularly that flat surfaces are the enemy, but overall it's definitely been a success. This is possibly the video that's taken the most actual man hours I've ever done, but if that hasn't put you off and you wanted to give this a go yourself, the actual cost in bits off eBay was only about 40 quid, plus a couple of small bits I already had. And I'll give a parts list as best as I can in the description. If you do give it a go, let me know, because that would be wicked. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye for now.